Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of all of us at the locally based, independently owned bookstore, Books and Books in Miami, Florida, and in partnership with Miami Book Fair, it's my pleasure to welcome you to a virtual evening with Frank Bruni and Lizette Alvarez to discuss The Beauty of Dusk on Vision Lost and Found, published by our friends at Avid Reader Press. Frank Bruni has been a prominent journalist for more than 3 decades, including more than 25 years at the New York Times, the last 10 of them as a nationally renowned op-ed columnist who appeared frequently as a television commentator. He was also a White House correspondent for the Times, its Rome bureau chief, and for 5 years, its chief restaurant critic. He is also the author of 3 New York Times bestsellers. In July 2021, he became a full-time professor at Duke University, teaching media-oriented classes in the School of Public Policy. He continues to write his popular weekly newsletter for the Times and to produce occasional essays as one of the newspaper's official contributing opinion writers. To moderate tonight's conversation, we are also joined by Lizette Alvarez, who is an award-winning journalist and an opinion columnist for the Washington Post. Prior to that, she spent 22 years at the New York Times, based in Washington, London, New York, and Miami. She also served as the Times' Miami bureau chief for 8 years. She began her career at the New York Daily News and the Miami Herald. Throughout this evening's broadcast, you're invited to ask questions by using the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen, and please order your copy of The Beauty of Dusk from Books and Books below by pressing the green button. We appreciate each and every order and the generous donations from viewers everywhere. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I am very excited to talk to my friend and former colleague from the New York Times, Frank Bruni, about his fabulous new book. And I just want to say quickly a few things about Frank. First of all, I think he's one of the most versatile reporters I've ever known. And he's had so many jobs, just diverse jobs, that it's difficult to keep track. But he's been a film critic. He's been obviously a general assignment reporter. He covered the presidential campaigns. He ultimately was Rome bureau chief, where he ventured across Europe writing about many things and landed in Iraq a few times. He also came back and became the food critic for the New York Times, which is a much coveted job. And then from there, he kind of leapt to columnist, another very sought after job at the New York Times and a very influential job as well. And all that's great. But the thing that I love most about Frank is that he's actually an incredible human being. He's just a great person. He's kind, he's generous. And I also still harbor a bit of envy at how facile he is as a writer, because while under any kind of stressful situation, the words just tunnel into his brain at rapid fire. For me, they more like plod very slowly, and it takes me forever to write anything down. And so he's a virtuoso, I would say. And I'm not exaggerating. I love him. That's why I'm saying it. But he is a fabulous person. And so I'm not at all surprised that he wrote this book, which is incredibly honest and forthright. It's called The Beauty of Dusk. And in that book, Frank was very truthful about his own crisis when he suddenly woke up one morning and really lost a huge amount of vision in his right eye, and didn't quite know what to make of that. And he exposes to us his own vulnerabilities and also his determination and his grit to overcome this huge crisis and this disability that he is now coping with. And so he also did it with a huge amount of curiosity, which, hats off to you, because it just makes the book a very, very compelling read. So my first question is, when you woke up that morning and all of a sudden opened your eye and it was incredibly just blurry and bleary-eyed, as many of us would do at that moment, you immediately assumed you were hungover. But in fact, it turns out that that was not the case. But tell us how you felt when you woke up and how you began to discover what had occurred to you.
Gladly. But first of all, I want to thank you all for being here. And I especially want to thank, Books and Books. I'm such a I'm such a fan of independent bookstores and so grateful for them. And I want to thank, above all, Lizette Alvarez. As Lizette mentioned, we've been friends for a very long time. Before you all joined this Zoom, Lizette and I were talking and realizing we've known each other. What did we decide it was 27 years, Lizette?
1995.
Right. And this is when you're all supposed to think, but we both look so young, we couldn't have known each other for 27 years. But Lizette was being very self-effacing about herself as a writer. And when you talk about kind of generous, warm, wonderful people, that list begins with Lizette and her husband, Don, and give my love to Don. And I'm just so psyched to be here with you tonight. And thank you all for joining us. So to answer your question, Lizette, it feels, it was only 4.5 years ago. It feels like a century ago at this point. But I just remember thinking, above all, like, this is nothing big. This is going to be solvable. I was born in 1964, which is the last year of the baby boom. And I think there is this sense of boomer invincibility. We've lived in an era where medical advances have been so profound and so numerous. And I just assumed that, okay, like, this will go away in a couple of hours. And if it doesn't go away in a couple of hours, I'll see my eye doctor tomorrow or the next day, it won't really matter. And I'll get I'll get a bottle of drops, or I'll get a bottle of pills, or I'll be told there are some simple eye calisthenics I can do, and this will go away. I just assumed that there was going to be an instant or nearly instant remedy, and that this was just a fluky thing, like a bad shoulder and someone shoots some prednisone in it and boom, you feel good as new. But what happened was quite different. In the span of, in this really crazy, frenzied 2 weeks, I first learned, after going to a second doctor who was a specialist in what seemed to be my problem, that I would never, that the sight to my right eye would never be fully restored, or really restored beyond my flawed vision at that moment. I learned that I was living with a significant risk because of what had happened to me, because of the nature of it, the identity of it, of my left eye going the same route. And so within 4 or 5 days, I learned that I would live forevermore, and I do live, at a substantial risk of going blind. And within 2 weeks, I was in a NIH supervised clinical trial of an experimental treatment, and somebody was sticking a needle into my right eye, which was the nature of that trial. So it was, that morning and the next 2 weeks were just a complete transformation of my life. And by then, I was in a state of combined shock and terror.
It's interesting because at one point in the book, you describe yourself as a pessimist, which is a quality that I never really saw in you, in terms of the relationship that I had with you. And I'm wondering how you managed to then begin to turn that around. Was that a very slow kind of turning around, or did your determination kind of kick in and push the pessimism aside?
It's a great question. It was quicker than I thought. I do think of myself as a pessimist, which sort of contradicts what I said about, I thought there'd be a remedy for this right away, because in the realm of medicine, in the realm of like ailments, I thought, no, we've got that cracked. And of course, we've all had, it's weird because what happened to me 4.5 years ago, I kept thinking about that when the pandemic started, when we're all dealing with COVID, in terms of the themes of uncertainty, of suddenly being confronted with limits and having to develop workarounds. It was almost like we were all going through the kind of medical episode that some of us have gone through in different ways at different points of our lives. And we were all kind of being asked to find measures of resilience that we maybe hadn't before. I thought there'd be a change, but I was a pessimist in terms of, I used to spend so much time thinking about not my blessings, but my slights. So much time thinking about not my advantages, but some of the things that hadn't worked out in my life, or that I struggled against that other people didn't. And I'm still struggling to explain precisely why. The book, in part, is an exercise in trying to explain why. But pretty soon into this, I realized that if I gave into my pessimism, if I gave into self-pity, if I gave into fear, I was going to dig myself a really deep hole that, unless I planned to live in that hole forevermore, the deeper I dug it, the harder it was going to be to climb out. And I sprung into sort of action and summoned a determination that I didn't know I had. And I'm really a pretty ordinary person at the end of the day. And one of the reasons I wanted to tell my story, and one of the reasons I wrote this book, is because I wanted to send the message to everyone that however much you fear some sort of limitation, maybe associated with old age coming down the road, however much you think you will just kind of curl into the fetal position and crumple in the face of hardship, you may well discover, because I did, that you are nimbler than you ever imagined. You are more resilient than you ever imagined. We all have reserves of strength in us that I think we underestimate, and that I think if we realized it and if we embraced it, we would live in much less fear, and we would in particular kind of march into old age with much more optimism than we might otherwise feel. And my turnaround was pretty quick, and it really, really surprised me. I would not have predicted it. If you had told me, Lizette, like 4.75 years ago, in a couple of weeks, you're going to wake up, you're not going to be able to see properly. You're never going to see exactly properly forevermore. You're going to be living with this sort of possible blindness dangling over you. And you're going to go through 2 different trials, as I eventually did, one where they're going to stick a needle in your eye several times, and one where you're going to actually inject yourself twice a week for 6 months. How are you going to deal with that, Frank? I would have said, I'm going to be in a fetal position for months, if not years, and I'm going to only welcome people to my bedside if they're bearing gin and a martini shaker. I would have been sincere, and that's not what happened, and there's a real lesson in that for everybody.
So you've now mentioned the needle situation twice.
I want credit for my needle endurance.
And you need it. You deserve the credit for your needle. So Frank he had the privilege to undergo 2 separate trials to try to see if any of them might perhaps help restore his vision. And the first one was horrific. Frank will tell you in more detail than I'm going to, but basically it was a needle going into his eye, and you use the allusion to Clockwork Orange, which is also embedded in my psyche forever. The clamps, the eyes being held open like that, it was terrifying. But I also thought of the Marathon Man, the dentist. You remember when he he starts drilling into the teeth? It gave me that same kind of like heebie-jeebie feel. But tell me a little bit about what the experience was like, but also, you obviously at some point must have had a sense of hope that this would help, and tell me about what happened with that.
I don't, it's interesting. I don't know that I had much hope, because I really did understand not only that these were trials of drugs that they were trying to determine whether there was any efficacy, but also, and this is the real kind of hell of deciding, and probably several people listening tonight have been in clinical trials because they happen all the time for all sorts of ailments. But one of the really tough things to factor into it when you're deciding, do I want to go through this? Do I want to essentially become a human subject, and sometimes at great discomfort and pain to yourself? You could end up being one of the people who gets the placebo. You could be doing it for no. So it was a really kind of interesting test of like, who are you fundamentally? And we talk about that pessimism, optimism axis. I didn't discover I was an optimist, but I discovered that I was a person who would rather take action than lie back and wait. And this felt to me like, whether I ended up in the placebo group, I was still kind of helping science try to solve the riddle of my condition. It felt to me like a way of exercising some agency and taking some control in a situation where so much control seemed to be taken away from me. And that turned out for me to be really psychologically meaningful. It doesn't mean it would be for everyone. And I think one of the things that everyone needs to do if they come upon a hardship, struggle, or crossroads like this, is you really have to pause and think, who am I? What do I need? What's going to make me feel better? And then you need to do that thing. And it won't be the same thing for every 2 people, but it is really important that you sit with yourself and say, what is going to make me feel a little bit better about what's happening to me, and do that thing,
It's interesting. Your approach also seems to speak to our journalistic skills in a way. On different levels, I find. Number one is just your ability to really kind of ask hard questions, and questions that will enlighten you, and be able to get answers. You know how to get answers to the extent that that's possible. But the second, and for me, I have felt this in my own life when I'm dealing with hardships. As a reporter, we've been thrust into many situations that aren't fun to deal with. There are terrorist attacks, mass shootings, airplane crashes. We're dealing with tragedy and extreme grief in a very close level. And I found at an early age that I was able to learn how to disassociate, which is not always a bad thing. That I was able to unplug from my own emotions in the moment to be able to focus on what was happening around me and the emotions of the people who I was dealing with. And after a while, I think this does kind of catch up to you, but I feel like this ability to disassociate is something that I think would be extremely beneficial on some level when you're beginning to deal with something like that. Did you find that that was true? Did your journalism chops kind of help you down this path?
That's such a smart observation, and I'd never really thought of it that way. But yes, 100 times, 1,000 times, yes. As you were describing that thing we do as journalists, where we need to cover it, but we need to establish an emotional distance. That as you were describing that, I thought, yeah, that all rang true and resonated for me in terms of behaving as a journalist with other people. And yeah, as you said, that I realized I did that a little bit with myself. I kind of saw myself to a certain degree, to a very kind of healthy, emotionally stabilizing degree. I saw myself as a subject, even as I was the person going through it. And, I have become so much more aware and so much more appreciative of my blessings, and I'm a more grateful person than I was before this happened, because I really do think that one of the ways you get through an episode like this, and I wish I'd learned this earlier because I think it's the best way to get through life, is to realize there's no sense in tallying your diminishments, your losses, your challenges. That the only emotionally wise thing to do is focus on the abilities that remain and the pleasures that remain, and your agency in forging a path to those things. That was huge. But and I mentioned that because I quickly realized, and I feel this very much this day, training as a journalist, the disposition of a journalist in the way that you just described, but also in other ways, was an enormous blessing to me at this juncture, remains a blessing. And in the way you said, but also, I became a student of my disease. I decided I'm going to turn this in to a journalistic project. I'm going to turn this into an intellectual adventure. And I did that in many ways, and I describe it in the book. And I think they're examples not of how journalists cope, but how we as human beings kind of take a look at all the arrows in our quiver and decide which ones are going to help me in this situation. But this was kind of distilled and symbolized by the fact that I wangled a free trip to Greece on the New York Times out of my affliction. When I realized in the second drug trial that I was a part of, the one where I was sent home with needles and syringes and a sharps container, and having been taught to inject myself in the thigh, or this time like twice a week for 6 months, I obviously asked, what's this medicine? I was told it's derived from the resin of the mastic tree. What's the mastic tree? The mastic tree is this evergreen that only grows in very particular Mediterranean climates, and mostly in Greece, and mostly on this one island of Greece. I went like ding, ding, ding. And I went to my editor and I said, don't you think I should write a column of man goes to meet his medicine? And so I wangled a trip to the island of Chios, and I walked among the mastic trees and fingered their leaves and branches and all of that. Now, I'm not saying when you become ill, wangle a free trip to Chios, because you may not be in a position to. But I think it's a kind of metaphor and example of like taking a moment and saying, okay, what can I do with this that makes it more than a tragedy that has befallen me? How can I turn this into something else that either has some emotional satisfaction in it or has some intellectual engagement in it? And in my case, I was blessed enough to be able to take a journalistic trip to Greece on the dime of the New York Times.
Gold star for you. That was the pinnacle of being able to fuse those two missions together, I would say. That's unbelievable. But the one thing, you mentioned the injections again, you need to then tell us what it was like to have that needle sticking right into your eyeball.
I describe it at the end of the first chapter of the book, and I describe it, I hope, quickly and let everybody move on, because the book is ultimately a hopeful book that, as you know, and alluded to in the beginning, is not really about eyes, is not really about vision. It's about kind of struggle and attitude. But I mean, it was horribly painful. It was horribly painful. And then it was over, and that's the thing, I made it worse for myself the first time out by dreading and dreading and dreading and dreading it, because then it was over, and onward you go. And we're just like, we can, I don't want to be a Pollyanna. There are situations of extreme hardship, of extreme deprivation, of cataclysm. I mean, look at what people in Ukraine are going through, just to bring this to current events. There are situations that there is no way to spin in a positive direction. There's no way with a mere shift of attitude and disposition to be okay with. But there are also a lot of struggles and hardships in life that are more quotidian, and that are more or less survivable, based on the trust you have in yourself and what you draw out of yourself. And I learned that we are so much more nimble, so much nimbler and more adaptable than we realize. And the clinical trial that really taught me more was the second one, because I am really not exaggerating. You are looking at one of the least dexterous human beings who is, Homo sapiens, who's ever been on the planet. Like, I frequently don't tie my shoes properly. I frequently somehow end up with knots in my shoelaces that I can't undo. It took a sequence of male relatives beyond my father to teach me how to tie a necktie, which I still do badly enough that when I used to appear on CNN regularly, I would have viewers write in and say nice things like, "You seem like a very cute and nice man, but your necktie is a disaster." And they were correct, right? When they told me, we're going to teach you to like take this vial of this compound and draw it with what you're going to attach a needle to a syringe and use one needle to draw it out of its vial, and then you're going to switch the needle and use another needle to inject. I mean, I was like, this is never going to happen. And the first time I did it at home, after I had to do it once under the watchful eye of medical professionals, like, I had the video in front of me, I had the handbook in front of me. It was like 2 hours of like convincing myself I could do it. Within 3 months, I would have that vial out of the fridge. I would transfer it to the right syringe. It was like a 30-second thing. If I can go to that, I mean, we are all so much more adaptable than we realize.
That's great. Another part of your book that I absolutely loved, and I want to get this in at this point, just in case for some reason we start running out of time, because I really wanted to talk about it, was this whole idea of a sandwich board. That you said that you realized that there are so many people that you knew and still know who have their own pain. They're carrying their own hardships and their own suffering, but people don't want to reveal it. And this has always been, for me, something that I have hated. I have always rebelled against this idea that there should be shame and discomfort in the things that are difficult in our life, or that go wrong. I don't know if it's wrong is the right word, because sometimes it just is. But people just don't ever want to discuss it, because it feels like it's a sign of weakness for them to talk about it. And I've never understood that, because I really feel, and this is a cliche, but that it takes a village, that we learn from each other, not only how to live well, but how to cope with frailness and with suffering and with things that go wrong. And I get very frustrated because there's so much secrecy. And I love that you talked about this. So tell me how you came to this awakening and how you decided to like make this part of your ethos now.
Well, I agree with everything you said, and I've had that same frustration. And it's a two-way street, because you're right. People are reluctant to talk about it for the reasons you say. But even when they're not reluctant to talk about it, we're reluctant to ask anybody what they're going through, because we somehow have deemed that invasive or intrusive. And I liked it when people said, "How are you coping? What has this been like?" It felt like they were seeing me, and in a given moment, it may have actually given me an invitation to get some stuff off my chest that I wanted to. I realized early on that the greatest trap of my situation, or a situation like mine, was self-pity, was the idea like, why is this happening to me? And I just sort of intuitively began like looking at everyone around me through the question, I don't normally evaluate this person this way, but what do I know of that person's own struggles? Recent, current. What do I know of the pain that person is carrying that is invisible, so I never reacquaint myself with it. I never think about it. And I mean, person after person, I'm like, that friend of mine has dealt for more than a decade now with a severely autistic child, and all of the questions and all of the heartaches of how am I going to make sure this person I love is well cared for throughout her life. This person over there, this guy who I worked out with at my gym, I never thought about something I knew that he never talked about, which is he had lost his son to a terrible tragedy when his son was 8, and on and on and on. And I thought to myself that, and I call the chapter about this the sandwich board theory of life. If we offer a few days war sandwich boards that just listed the main fears we lived with, the main struggles we were enduring then or had overcome, all of us would realize that whatever we were going through, that struggle, that pain, I don't mean to be a downer at this moment, those are the default human condition. We would be much less prone to self-pity. We would be much quicker to empathy. And I think the world, all in all, would be a much more nurturing place. And that was a really, really important realization for me. And it was also triggered in part by, I remember not that long after this happened to me, in the span of a couple of days, these two people in public life took their own lives, Anthony Bourdain and Kate Spade. And it was so haunting, because I can't count the number of times I thought to myself, as someone who worked for many years in the world of food writing, food commentary, boy, I wish I was Anthony Bourdain. That guy has it made. I struggle not to gain weight. He's skinny as a beanpole. I use my own money to travel. He's going all over the world on the Travel Channel and CNN's. I feel like I work hard to come up with a witty phrase that just tumbles off of his lips, boom, boom, boom. And how many people thought Kate Spade has it made? I want to be her. Those were two people who are obviously struggling with a whole lot, but they don't wear sandwich boards. And so we don't know that. And so when we measure our own situation against theirs, we're using totally imagined and false yardsticks. I think it's just such an important thing that we kind of know when it's pointed out to us, but we forget and we don't keep in mind.
And it's true that you say that we don't ask, because that was another question I wanted to discuss with you. I find I have a really hard time asking disabled people about their disability. Now, if they're like obviously my relatives or super close friends, no, but just, people, acquaintances. And I always feel like I'm prying and I'm going too far. And I know that you experienced this with your friend Dory, who has college friend who has Parkinson's, and for years you never really delved too deeply into how she was and how she copes. And the same thing with Senator Bob Kerrey of Nebraska, who was a source, who became a friend, who lost a leg or part of a leg in Vietnam, and you never talked to him about it, and until you decided to write this book. And so, first off, I just wanted to say, why is it so hard for us to give, to actually find out how people are feeling when they're disabled? But also, what did you learn from them when they spoke to you about it?
Well, I think it's hard for us, partly because, as I said before, I think we're worried about being invasive and intrusive. But if we're really being honest, it's hard for us because we're not sure we want to sit with the answers to the questions. We're not sure we want to invest the emotion, the time, or send the message that we're there. We're actually, I think, sometimes keeping a distance because we don't want the responsibility. We don't know what's going to happen if we open that box. But, I'm just going to, you gave two great examples from the book of people who were in my life and had been through or were going through extraordinary struggles that I'd never asked about for all sorts of good and terrible reasons, right? But I want to focus on Bob Kerrey because it was so interesting to me. I had developed this friendship over the years with Bob Kerrey. I admire him enormously. And he had given me every signal that his life was an open book. Like, we would drink tequila together and he would talk about what it was like when he was single to date Deborah Winger, a big movie star, right? And he wasn't like coy about it. Like, he was giving me every signal, like, I love talking to you. I trust you. My life's an open book. And yet I never asked him, hey, I know that you lost a part of your leg in Vietnam and have lived forever more like that. What's that like? Before I approached him about it, and I felt I suddenly had a reason because I was doing the book, did what we do as journalists, Lizette. I Googled a bunch of stuff. I did some internet searches, and I could read a lot about, there was a kind of revised and contested history over what happened during his service in Vietnam. I could read a lot about that. I could read a lot about what went wrong with his 1992 presidential campaign. I could find no interviews about how he had adapted to living without a part of his leg. And it was because people just didn't go there. The minute I said, Bob, I want to schedule a lunch with you, but not one of our usual lunches where we just shoot the shit about a gazillion different things and nothing at all. I want to schedule a lunch with you about, I want to hear the story of losing your leg and how that forged you and what's that. And it was an immediate yes. We went to the lunch. It was the only thing we talked about. He knew it was for public consumption. And I thought, why did I wait? And that question, why did I wait, goes back to your question. Why do we all wait? I think because we're too polite. I think because we're scared. I think because we're worried of it being on the hook to be responsible and present. And at the end of the day, I don't think those are good reasons. I don't think they justify our behavior.
That's so interesting. I think you're so right. Definitely. And it's true. We're afraid maybe to get too invested in it, right? Yeah, that's actually a really good point.
Asking the question can sound like saying, I'm here for whatever you need.
Right.
And I don't think it is.
Right.
And if it is saying, I'm here to some extent, well, why not be there to some extent, right?
Right. Exactly. There was something else that you mentioned in the book, which fascinated me, is that you said that this experience drew you closer to a higher power, and that you found yourself praying. And I know you grew up Catholic to a certain extent, but then and then left the church, basically became not a non-believer, but you weren't an institutional church guy. Did it surprise you that happened, and did it comfort you in the end?
It comforted me enormously, and it's kind of hard to put a vocabulary to it, because I do believe I began praying, but what I began doing that I then realized was a form of prayer. I wasn't praying to God. I still don't know that I believe in God or a God. I was having a sort of dialogue or a conversation with the saner and healthier part of myself. That's the way I experienced, but maybe that is an experience of God. I don't know. I don't know is my most honest answer to a gazillion things. This teased out of me a much greater humility than I'd ever felt before. And all I know is that there is a spiritual side to so many of us that can be of enormous comfort if you don't worry about whether it means you believe in God, if you don't try too hard to label or name it. I have moments of, lowercase m meditation. I don't mean like meditation, but I have moments of reflection, of quiet meditation, of dialogue with myself, often when I'm taking a long walk in the woods near my house with my dog Regan, that feel to me like my version of prayer, and that make me understand prayer in a way I never did before. I've always respected it. I didn't fall away from the Catholic Church. I had parents who really weren't that committed to the Catholic education. And I've always respected enormously people of faith, because it is, for all of the contests and conflagrations we had around faith, I also realize that enormous good has been done and is good is done in the world by people of faith. But what I have a new respect for is prayer in the infinite forms it takes.
Interesting. Yeah. I agree. Can be very helpful, right? So you spoke with people who are either blind or have some kind of disability, as we talked about, and you wove those stories into your book. And most of them are extremely life-affirming stories. And I love two in particular. I love James Holman, who's the blind world explorer, because I'm just a huge traveler.
Wait, I have to interrupt you. Like, I'd never heard of him before.
I know.
How do we all, we'll get into him in a second, everyone. How do we all not know who James Holman is once you realize what he represents, right?
Completely. And so he was an explorer he lived from 1786 to 1857. So we're talking like ships, endless voyages, like disease everywhere, and he's blind. So that was amazing. And when I came away with from that James Holman experience was a reevaluation of my own travel experience, which I'm not one of these camera people who takes photographs of everything, but there's an over reliance on sight, on seeing, as opposed to using your other senses, which is obviously what he had to do. So tell us about why you decided to include him and what,
Well, I love that you just said that your emphasis is on sight and seeing, because one of the things I say in the book that kind of blew me away when I looked at it through my new eyes, the fact that we call so much travel sightseeing, which is such a redundant word. Like sight, once you've said sight, seeing is like, what the heck? But it shows you how much we privilege, like it shows you our prejudice for the eyes as the main sense with which you travel and interpret the world. This man, James Holman, was arguably the most famous travel writer of his time in the English language. He was British. And he was blind, and he was writing these long travel tomes that had quite a bit of currency in England at the time. And he was experiencing places solely through, taste, sound, the sense of feel. People would relay information to him that he would take in through his ears. He would use a very crude instrument to essentially kind of commit with his fingers the information to words. But he did all of this as a blind man. He covered exponentially more miles than Marco Polo. And Marco Polo, no, and it made me wonder, all of us know Marco Polo, like we're in the pool. We should if the world was a just place when we were in the pool, we wouldn't be saying Marco Polo, we'd be saying James Holman, because this guy was so much more extraordinary. And he just realized, not because anyone taught him to, but just because he was an extraordinary human being, that not being able to see the world was not the same as not being able to experience the world. And that is a lesson and a parable that so transcends blindness or deafness or anything like that. We have so much information, so much experience, so much data available to us beyond what we think. And losing one ability, having new parameters put over some abilities, does not mean that we no longer can experience the world in a robust and hugely satisfying way. And he is maybe the individual in history, strangely unknown, who best exemplifies that. We talk about Helen Keller all the time. James Holman is his own Helen Keller, and he's Helen Keller with Magellan mixed in,
Yeah, no, incredible. And what you do is you rely on your other senses, your other ways of perceiving the world, which is so deep and brilliant, and really the next trip I'm going on, I'm going to definitely work to do that. The other person I loved in your book was, I wrote his name down here, is Cyrus Habib. I feel like there are not enough Cyrus Habibs in the world, because his journey is so incredible. He was blind at the age of 8, basically, and was a successful politician, and then summited Mount Kilimanjaro, and then decided to give it all up and become a Jesuit priest, which is a lot of training goes into becoming a Jesuit priest, and a lot of I guess pushing away everything that we know, our ego, our possessions, and so for me this was very mind-blowing. He wanted to do it because he wanted to take ego out of the equation of helping people, basically, right? And so what did you learn from him?
Well, I turned to him because I was looking for examples of blind people of extraordinary accomplishment. And he was, in his late 30s, the lieutenant governor of the state of Washington. And one of the youngest people anywhere in the country to have become second in command of a state of that size. Was a Rhodes Scholar, had gone to Yale Law, I think his roommate at Yale Law, I think they were roommates. I interviewed him, and he's in the book. Ronan Farrow was his roommate at Yale Law. What I learned from him is I wanted to ask the question, and I asked it in part through Bob Terry. They're in the same section of the book, but in part through Cyrus Habib. When you have been humbled by a loss of ability, by this kind of medical crisis, whether it's Bob Terry's amputated leg or whether it's Cyrus Habib's loss of vision at 8, does it maybe crack you open to a sort of reflectiveness and empathy and soulfulness that you might not have gotten to in another way. And I say might not have, because I think people can be hugely soulful and reach pinnacles of emotional wisdom without anything bad happening to them. But I also think it can be the case that when you have had an early taste of a particular kind of hardship, it can lead you to spiritual realizations, spiritual considerations, questions that wouldn't have come to you in the same way or with the same force otherwise. And Cyrus Habib is a really, really good example of that. If you ask him about this crazy swerve where he goes from being someone who's next in line to being governor of the state of Washington, who if that had worked out, would have become governor of the state of Washington at such a young age. People would have begun to talk about his national political prospects as a Democrat. When you ask him, how do you go from that to suddenly saying, no, I'm going to give up the job, I'm not going to run for re-election, I'm going to take vows of obedience and chastity and poverty, and not just trained to be a Catholic priest, but trained to be a Jesuit, which is one of the longest, most arduous courses of education. He will tell you that his blindness is part of that some of the questions that he was asking throughout his life, because of his experience of being an outsider, because of his experience of being different, he will tell you that that's all related. And that fascinated me and in some ways heartened me. And that's what I took from him. And that's why he's in the book.
Great. I think we're going to go to some questions now. I still have many more, but we're going to go to audience questions because theirs, I am sure, is as fabulous as can be. So let's see. 1 in 5 Americans lives with a disability. Many of these folks have acquired disabilities as they age. Why is the fight for ADA accommodations and other supports for low vision, mobility, etc., still so difficult?
It's a great question. Because we have trouble. I mean, we see this on so many fronts beyond disability, because we have real troubles and challenges as Americans caring about people who are not in our own situation. Because we have this sort of the pie is only so big mentality. And if I give you this, I can't give that person that. I think we are impeded altruists. I do think altruism exists in human nature, but I think a lot of other stuff competes with it. And I think there's something about the nature of modern life and the nature of American life that lets too much compete with what I believe are the fundamental human talents for altruism and empathy. I think we're selfish.
True enough. Let me go to another one. Frank, this is from Don. Frank, congrats on your fabulous new book. Book writing is so difficult and often painful. So why did you decide to write this book? It seemed to be a catharsis for you. Was it? And what other feelings and emotions did you have as you reported and wrote your book?
I don't know if it was you or me, but there was a little bit of a Zoom freeze as you asked that question. So okay. I missed it. I'm so sorry.
Oh, that's okay. Basically, it was Don's question. He was asking why you decided to write this book. It seemed like it was a form of catharsis to you. And so did it end up being a form of catharsis? And what other emotions kind of played into it as you were developing the book?
Yeah, I decided to write this book because I was embarked upon a kind of journey of figuring out, when you are dealt this sort of medical crisis, this sort of fear, hey, you may go blind, and a week ago that never occurred to you. I was on a personal journey of like, how do I process this in a way that is not defeatist and destructive? Whom do I talk to? On and on. And I quickly realized, like, whatever that journey I was going on was, because I am a writer, because I'm a journalist, that might be worth sharing. Because for me, it's a journey prompted by a failure of eyesight. For someone else, it is a journey prompted by Parkinson's or multiple sclerosis or cancer. And that there might be things I would learn, experiences I would go through that would have, a quasi-universal relevance. And that's why I decided to write the book. I mean, and that's a sort of grand way of articulating something that I mentioned early in the book, I think at the beginning of the second chapter, which is when you're a journalist or a writer, I don't have to tell you this, Lizette, and I don't have to tell Don this. Your trade, your reflex, your tick is to turn the material in life and in your own life into journalism, into writing. And Nora Ephron, who I was one of my many blessings, and as I said, I'm more conscious of those blessings than ever before, was that in the last decade of her life, I met her and became a friend of hers and spent some time with her. She had a very famous saying, which became the title of one of her son's posthumous documentary about her: everything is copy. And what she meant is that if you're a writer, you try to fashion the material of your and other people's lives into something meaningful. And so this happened, and there was drama to it, the needles in the eye. There was challenge to it. And I heard Nora's voice: everything is copy. Use this. Make something meaningful out of this.
Totally. I love that everything is copy. My daughter sometimes tries to write comedy, and I'm like, everything's a bit, everything's a bit, right?
But we should also explain, because copy is an outmoded term, but right. When you were at the Daily News years and years ago, when I was at the New York Post, copy was what you called newspaper writing. It's like, here's my copy. And so everything is copy. Nora, with that dictum, was betraying her own roots at the New York Post back in the 1970s.
That's true. Here's another question that's very interesting. It's about mental health from Tess. She said, I haven't read your book, and listening to you, it seems it covers human struggle and our coping mechanisms to deal with it. Sometimes we succeed and sometimes we don't. I would like to know what your recommendations and suggestions are when it comes to mental illness, which can be camouflaged and not easily detectable.
I don't have a great answer for that, because I think mental illness is mental illness. Mental illness. It isn't. One cannot extrapolate neatly from physical illness to mental illness. And I try to be. I'd love to have an answer for everything, but I try to be really careful about not speaking beyond the bounds of my own experience and not speaking beyond the bounds of my own expertise. And so I don't know the answer to that. And certainly you can't say to a person who's suffering from mental illness, well, here's the attitude adjustment you need to do. Because the problem is in the brain. The problem is in the outlook. The problem is in that neurochemistry over which the person does not have complete or even adequate control. So I don't know. I don't have the education, the expertise, or the professional credentials to responsibly and credibly answer that question.
Another viewer here has a very good question, which probably I should have asked early on, and I didn't because we got wrapped up in conversation. But what was your actual diagnosis?
Oh, yeah. So my diagnosis, I have something that goes by the abbreviation, the initials NAION. And sometimes I can't even remember how to say that, but it means Non-Arteric Anterior Ischemic Optic Neuropathy. And that's a long term that basically means I had a stroke of the optic nerve, and for reasons that sometimes they can figure out and sometimes they can't, there was a sudden drop in my blood pressure, and the blood flow to one of my optic nerves was cut off, and my optic nerve essentially, in large measure, died. Your optic nerve connects your eye to your brain. If it doesn't work, you are not going to be able to see properly. And among the things that medicine has not solved is we do not know how to regenerate nerve growth. If we did, we could deal with a lot of things we can't deal with, like Alzheimer's, like paralysis, et cetera. And in fact, the second drug trial I was in, the first drug trial I was in was for a compound that would have been exclusively useful to people who'd had happened to them what happened to me. The second drug trial I was in was actually that compound, that resin of the mastic tree. That was actually a drug that they were hoping they would be able to use for spinal cord injuries, for Alzheimer's, for all sorts of stuff that had a bigger population than my rare disorder. The reason they were using those of us with NAION as test subjects is if you're trying to figure out if something is working, there is no neater and cleaner way to do that than to use people who are reading letters on an eye chart and can literally say, I can get to the next line or I can't. Because the optic nerve just governs eyesight. And so you can judge whether it is being regenerated by simply giving people vision tests. But that's what I have. And the literature suggests that when NAION strikes one eye, it has revealed anatomical peculiarities or physiological peculiarities that mean you are at greater risk than someone else of it happening in your other eye.
Great, thanks. Doris also had something very nice to say, which is thank you so much for writing this book. I had my first needle in the eye experience last year when I went to my regular eye appointment. Since then, I have been living with the fear of possibly going blind. Your book really speaks to me, and it has given me hope that I will be all right, which is lovely.
Thank you for sharing that.
Jordan wants to know how much your other senses were heightened, and what was that like?
That's a really great question because there are many, many examples. And I introduced some of these individuals in the book of people having certain senses heightened when one sense is diminished. I haven't had that happen exactly, but certain faculties have come to the fore that weren't there before. So I don't think my hearing has been heightened, but I was one of those people who could never, ever listened to an audiobook before. My attention immediately wandered. I got distracted. And I really thought I was hopeless. And there was plenty of evidence for me to believe I was hopeless. When this happened, both because I have to read with larger font sizes, because if the light's not perfect, my reading can be difficult. I thought I'm going to try audiobooks again. I'm going to make a much more concerted effort because it would be great to have them in real time, but it would also be a consolation if I lose eyesight altogether to know that I can do an audiobook. I am now an audiobook whiz because I kept trying and kept trying. I probably consume 2/3 of the books that I consume by listening to them. And I started out like at below 1.0 speed, and now I'm up to 1.7 speed. And I know blind people who listen to audiobooks at like 2.1, 2.2, and I think I'm going to get there. And so I haven't had other senses heightened, but I've refined and developed faculties I didn't have before in compensation for diminished eyesight.
Yeah, and I found that was true in your the Central Park section, which I really loved because you lived near Central Park, and while you always ran there, you had never really explored it until this happened, and until you got Regan, who of course we all love now. Regan is beloved by everyone now who reads your book. But you really explored the nooks and crannies, and what I loved about that section was that you were deliberately being mindful, which is something that I, kind of shoot for a lot and fail miserably at even more, because it is so hard to just push out the events of the day and your life and chores and work. And so I loved that. So, but that also involved your senses. And so tell me how you felt you were able to be more mindful.
Well, knowing that, I'm sorry, I have a little lump in my throat, not emotional, but facing the fact that you could lose your eyesight, a sense altogether. I think it can, and in my case, it does make you triply appreciative of what you have in real time. And I found myself not letting pleasures and beauty pass me by in the way I did before. And you're right. I use Central Park as an example of this because when I was going through this, I lived on the edge of Central Park, not with a view of Central Park. I'm not that. I count my blessings, but I'm not that economically blessed or otherwise blessed. But a block and a half from Central Park. And I would go through that park with Regan, my dog, whom I acquired after this happened to me, in part because this happened to me. And I would just key in to aspects of that park's beauty, to pleasures that park could offer that I can't even say I took them for granted before. I didn't even notice they were there before. And I carried that over into so much else. Like when I pour myself a glass of wine now, like I look at the color of that glass of wine, I savor the first sip of that glass of wine in a whole different way. Because somehow this experience, I've converted it in a way where I don't ever want to take anything for granted before or not enjoy something that is there to be enjoyed. And I feel like a fool that it took a crisis to get me there.
Right.
And I hope, whether it's listening to this conversation or reading the book, that other people will get to that place without a crisis, in part because I'm giving you the view from post-crisis. But I don't ever want to be someone who does not notice and savor all of those things that are right there for us. For many of us, that we just don't pause and linger over and dwell in.
Yeah, that's so true. And you know, these are all such helpful reminders for all of us to what you're saying, to be like, okay, we forget and then we remember. So it's very nice to have this this reminder of it. Somebody on the chat wants to know just how bad your vision is in your right eye, and you might also want to talk about how then it affected your work in the end.
Yeah, it's interesting because the metrics by which we measure vision don't really kind of apply to my right eye. So this would frustrate me to no end. But one of the trials I was in, when they would try different, is this one better, worse, right? They determined, and this is crazy, you're going to hear this, you're going to think, well, Frank has no problems, but it's crazy. They determined that with the right lens, I could see 20/80 or 2100 in my right eye. But here's the way I saw 20/80 or 2100. They would show me a letter. And by the way, they're much more sophisticated eye tests than the actual line of letters. They can throw individual letters at you. They would throw an individual letter at me through these more sophisticated tests. And they would say, what is it? And I would say correctly, I can't see it. It's behind fog. And then I'd be like, wait a second. I just saw the top curve of it. And then I'd be like, oh, now I see the bottom curve of it. And they would give me like as much time as I wanted. And after 30 seconds, I could maybe, the fog over my right eye would move and shift enough that I'd seen various portions of the letter and I could then guess it. And that would count as correct. That would go towards saying, oh, you see 2100. And I would say to them, if I were friggin' reading Pride and Prejudice this way, like no relationship would ever be consummated. There'd be like, Elizabeth Bennet would never find her way to Darcy. I'd never get past the third paragraph.
Right.
So there's this weird rippled fog over the right side of my field of vision. I have to upsize font sizes. I have to often I commit all these typos because also what happens is your bad eye interacts with it interrupts your good eye. It screws things up. And so my depth perception is often screwed up. Weirdly, it's still legal for me to drive and I can drive. I drive much more carefully. But I will constantly, when I'm texting, I will hit the I instead of the O or the O instead of the I because they're right near each other. And my brain finger coordination as mediated by eyesight, where my right eye tries unsuccessfully to get involved, will screw up the position of objects in relation to each other. I will try to, when I was still living in New York, I would try to deal with the automated subway card thing. And I would think I was pressing inside the rectangle that said, yes, I want $20 put on my card. And nothing would happen because, in fact, my finger was outside of the rectangle, but my brain-eye coordination was all screwed up. That's what my vision is like. Yeah. So I can live fine. I can write. I can read. It all takes a little bit more time and a little bit more patience.
You mentioned at some point in your book, I think that you said you also felt like it muddled your thoughts a little bit when you were writing. So that because it took so much effort to
it's this weird thing where line as I'm writing or as I'm reading, lines of type will sometimes slant and they'll sometimes get swimmy. And there's this weird way in which when that happens, the fog of your vision almost becomes a fog of your brain, and your brain kind of seizes up. So everything just takes longer and more effort. But to kind of bring it full circle. There are moments, because I'm human, because I'm not a great person, where I scream in my head about that and get really pissed off and think this is friggin' unfair and I'm done with this and I'm just going to pour another glass of wine, one more than I should have, But then I think, I'm grappling with this because someone still employs me to produce words.
Right.
I'm grappling with this because I put words out into the world that people read. And to not be super appreciative of that and realize that that in the final equation, that, at the end of the day, there's so much more good than bad and I'm so much more blessed than cursed. I do not want to be the person who doesn't see that. And I was a person who often didn't see that, but I'm a person who almost always sees that now. And in that way, my vision hasn't dulled, it's sharpened.
Interesting. And so it seems to me like, yeah, I know you were so close to your mom and to your family. You're just a very tight family. And your mom passed away from cancer, but you seem to have drawn so many lessons from the way that she lived her life. And she had cancer for a very long time and dealt with her cancer and the possibility that her mortality was imminent, even though it ended up not being as imminent as you thought.
Yeah, she never felt sorry for herself and she never retreated, because her attitude, which she sometimes articulated almost this exact way, but mostly she modeled, her attitude was, cancer is going to shorten my life. Cancer is making my life more difficult and more painful. But if I retreat from life, if I stop doing what I can do with extra effort and energy, then cancer has scored a double victory over me. It's made me a victim twice over, and I'm not going to do that. That was her attitude. That was her behavior. And boy, was that really present in my memory and my thoughts when this happened to me. And, wow, am I grateful that I had the example of her, because it has been not so much inspiring as instructive.
Definitely. That's a blessing. Huge. Well, I think we're going to close it out here. I want to thank all of you for tuning in and watching this interview with Frank. And I encourage you all to, if you haven't already bought his book, to buy his book and please read it. And Frank, thank you so much for taking your time to talk about all of these very personal issues and for inspiring us to take kind of the same approach to our own lives, whether we're facing a disability or not.
Well, I can't thank you enough, Lizette, not just for your time and your kindness tonight, but thank you for, again, we're going to feel old. Thank you for almost 30 years of a really special friendship. I adore you and I appreciate you. And I thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Ditto.
Thank you both for tonight's conversation, and thank you everyone who joined and asked questions. Tonight's event has been really great, and I'm so happy to be a part of this. And don't forget to buy the book from Books and Books if you can, online or in store. And thank you both again.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.